right, Ben, let's move on to this area down here. There's a little VU meter, and this is called tape sat, which means, of course, tape saturation. Explain to me your design philosophy here and what you guys are trying to accomplish with including this.
Well, when we started talking about making a console recreation, and we looked at the workflows that were happening back when people were using analog Harrison consoles to make great records, we realized that a big part of the workflow back then was recording to tape. And tape does a lot of things that we don't like, but it had one benefit that we really wanted to take advantage of, and that is when you recorded to tape, there were loud transients in the music. I mean, high transients. For example, when you hit a snare drum, that initial transient at the very beginning of the stick hit is really it's too loud, and it wasn't recorded on the meters of the time. The analog meters at the time wouldn't capture that initial transient at all. So people would record to tape kind of loud, and that transient would get rounded off. It would get soft clip by the tape recording process. And the transient is so short, you really didn't hear that. I mean, the only effect was that the snare got louder because the body, the main part of the sound was louder because that initial transient didn't have to be accommodated. So you raise the level, and that transient was so short, your ear doesn't miss that transient. It's not really part of the dynamics of the song.
So you're essentially introducing a form of soft distortion into the music that's pleasing to your ears.
Right. It only affects these transients that are poking out above the rest of the music, and it has very little effect. If you're using that tape saturation correctly, where the meter is pointing up, straight up at 0, or maybe over to the 4 a little bit, but not into the red area, if you just use it very subtly, you really won't hear any difference. But it will have a pretty dramatic effect on the compressors and limiters and stages later in the mix, which is exactly what happened in those great recordings that were made to tape. What happened is the recording process affected how the later processing changed the sound. So it's the same thing. We've modeled the same thing in Mixbus, so that when you round off some of those transients slightly, later plugins and later our compressors and our limiters that are built in will see a different signal. They won't see that initial transient, and it will affect the way those digital compressors work. And it's one of those many subtleties that we found affected the sound in a pleasing way, and it was part of the workflow that was lost when we moved from a tape and console workflow into the digital audio workstation workflow. And it took some years before we had the hindsight to be able to look back and say what was then and what's now and what's missing. And that's part of what the tape saturation knob and that processing is all about.
Well, and obviously the effect is cumulative because you have tape saturation on each individual bus, plus you have tape saturation on the final output, the master.
That's right.
So, very similar to what happened in the recording process in the studio before, where when we went in, like in the 70s, we would be using a Studer 800 or a machine like that to do the individual tracks, which would introduce that type of tape sound, and then you would output on a 102, an Ampex 102 or something. It's going to have that same kind of effect. It'll be a cumulative thing.
You're exactly right, Chris. That was the plan. We wanted to have plenty of channels of it. We have 8 channels of it built in so that you get the parallel effect of recording to the tape tracks, the multi-track machine, and then also the final tape saturation, because there was that second stage of re-recording where you got another stage of the tape saturation. And so that you're exactly right. You nailed it on the head. That's how it works.
So it's a difference between having a choir singing and having a choir singing on single malt Scotch.
Exactly.
Sort of smooths things off a little bit. All right. Well, so let's talk a little bit about just below here. The actual knob that controls this is right here.
Right.
You can see that with the mouse, and if I turn it up and down here, what I'll do, I'll turn it down, and then I'll play a track here, and then I'll use the saturation, okay?
Okay.
I'm just going to do it on the one track here.
And I'll make a note again. When you're doing it right, you probably won't hear anything. In fact, in this video, I'm sure you won't be able to hear anything now. You can go ahead and push it all the way to the far right if you like, and it'll sound distorted and terrible, which is how it sounded when you overdrove tape ridiculously. You know, you never drove it that loud. But if you have it, the meter bouncing sort of up vertically or maybe a little to the right of that, you won't hear really any change, but it will dramatically change how the rest of the processing affects that sound.
And how it sums into the stereo output, right? Okay, let's try it. I'm going to turn the reverb off here. Bring it up. And I'll bring up the tape saturation. That's the rate up. There you go, it's set at 0. That's right down. All right. I guess one of the things I like to talk to you about is with this, what I've discovered, you know, being 60 now and having done music for 45 or 50 years and recording for the last 40 years, I've noticed these changes. Like not only was the recording process with using tape different then, it seemed to be a narrower band and it was a warmer sound, but the actual delivery system, the radios and stereos of that time really had a much narrower band. Now we're living in a world where we have a lot more fidelity, and the recording systems are a 32-bit floating point. You got way more headroom. So what you're doing here basically is trying to address that and take the sterility out of how a lot of DAWs sound when you sum them.
That's exactly right. We didn't want to impose those bandwidth limitations and the noise and all the problems that existed. We didn't want to bring any of that back. It's not about making a retro sound. It's trying to get to a good sound. And there were some stages of that recording process that just made the mix gel a little better. And they're very subtle. As I said before, just turning the knob up and it should be inaudible because it's only taking away those transients that are so short your ear really shouldn't notice those. That's not how our hearing works. The biological process of hearing isn't tuned to these microsecond waveforms. It's tuned to it's trying to pick out sustained tones and things like that. So when you turn up the tape saturation, you shouldn't be able to really hear it at all if you're doing it right, but your mix will end up sounding better.
Yeah, it's going to just provide an overall warmth and a more what we would consider real sound.
Yeah. Right.
Okay, so now let's talk a little bit. Let's go down here. Do you want to cover the rest of the bus here? It looks very similar when you get down in this area to one of the tracks. You've got a left-right pan.
Right.
Okay, and you've got the track name, which doubles to give you a readout if you're actually using something here. It tells you where you're going. So
right.
That works no matter what you're doing. It works here too when you bring in your saturation. Not that the numbers personally to me would mean that much, in terms of the saturation, but
right.
And you can change the name by double-clicking on this on Mixbus 1. You can change that name.
No, but you can hold Command. You'll notice oh, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I just said I noticed that you can right-click and rename it, right?
Yeah. You right-click and rename it.
And
you'll also notice that you can hold Command and click.
Okay, I'll do that. Oh yes, and you can shrink it down.
Right.
You showed me this the other day, so I can actually shrink all of them by going Command Shift, holding it down and clicking.
Right.
And that shrinks all of them down.
Right.
and then command
So if
click.
you have a busy mix with 30 tracks and 8 buses and a lot of things going on, that allows you to fit more on the screen and get an overview of the EQs and the levels and all those things. Now, because you've only got 2 tracks in this session, it's not terribly useful. So we'd like to leave everything wide so we can show it off. But when you really get into mixing, and it becomes less important to see, all the controls full size, you can shrink them down so that you get an overview of what's happening and you can see more channels at a time.
And of course, you can quickly shrink or bring up a track that you're working on by just command clicking, right?
Right.
On the individual track like this. All right. Well, to go back here to the bus, you've got a mute and solo, very similar to an individual track. You've got a compressor, limiter, leveler here. And so typically what would they use this for? Just overall compression to sort of glue something together. Say like you've sent 6 individual drum tracks out your drum kit into this bus, and you want to have an overall compression sound. You would use this.
That's right.
All right.
So we have a 3-way selector mode, and those adjust the ratio and the attack release times. Rather than give you the full controls of attack, release, and ratio, we looked at what people did most often, and there are really just 2 or 3 jobs that you spend all your time doing when you're doing pop music mixing. And those are the leveler mode, which, for example, is very often used in a vocal, where you want to control the level of the vocal so that it can be more present in the mix, even when the singer is singing quietly, or if the singer starts to really belt it out. The leveler just rides the level. It's very similar to someone holding their finger on a fader.
Yes.
So that the quiet parts are brought up a little bit and the loud parts are brought down a little bit, and
like
then
we tried to do in the old days.
like you do in the old days, right?
Yeah.
The compressor is a little bit more aggressive, and it might be used you might use that on the whole mix. You might use that to sustain a guitar sound a little bit longer or a drum sound a little bit longer. And then the limiter is even more specialized. It's even more aggressive, and it can be used for real transient shaping things. For example, sometimes if you run a drum through this type of limiter, it will actually accentuate the attack and make it sound more pronounced attack. And that's because there's a little bit of with the way the compressor works is there's a delay because of the attack time of the compressor. It doesn't begin compressing immediately when that first transient comes through, and then it begins to bring in the gain reduction after that. And so it sort of changes the shape of that dynamic thing. And so those are 3 of the things, and I'm speaking as a technical engineering person now, those are 3 things that we found a lot of producers and engineers, those are the techniques they're looking for. Those are the things they do all day long. Now, of course, you can always go add a specific compressor. If there's a specific sound you're looking for, you can go add that plugin.
Yeah.
But the 3 things that we're doing most of the time, level riding, that compression effect, and that limiting effect, where it changes the dynamic, the envelope of a sound. Those are the 3 things people are looking for all day long. So we simplified that down. We boiled that down to its essentials. You've got a 3-way selector that chooses which of those 3 things you're trying to do. And then we have a fast, slow knob. Can you point at the fast, slow knob?
Right
it's,
here.
that one. So that knob starts off pointed straight up, which is the nominal settings, and if you want to speed up the attack and release time, then you turn it to the left. That makes it gives it a faster attack and a faster release. If you want to slow it down for an instrument that has more low frequencies and needs a different type of sound, then you move it to the slow side. You turn it to the right.
So this would be for what? It would be for bass?
Yeah, generally speaking, most of the time the preset value, the straight up and down value, will work in almost every case.
Yeah.
If it distorts a little bit because the attack time is too fast, for example, a bass guitar will sometimes make it distort. So you'll slow it down. You'll slow down the attack time a little bit to avoid that distortion. The other thing you can do is by turning it to the slow side, you can get these pumping effects that a lot of dance music guys like to use, where you have a kick drum that brings everything down, and then the compressor slowly releases and lets the sound come back up. That pumping and breathing effect is part of a lot of dance music. That's why you might want to use the slower setting. And you can use the faster setting if you want a faster release. A lot of times on a vocal, on a singer, a real fast release time works, and that works along with the three different modes. So that fast slow is it's adjusting over a different range for the three different modes, and it's a little bit subtle.
So tell the folks typically what you'd use a faster setting for. Would that be for like a snare?
Well, it's really just artistic choices. There's no right or wrong on any of those settings. The only thing I would say is wrong is, sometimes if you have something with a lot of low frequency energy, if your attack time is set too short, it'll sort of ride those waveform and it'll sound distorted. And so you'll want to turn it slower so that the compressor doesn't make that distorted sound. I mean, that's the only thing I would say is right or wrong. Otherwise, it's all just artistic choices.
I think the use of a compressor warrants, a full tutorial.
I agree.
Yeah, for people, because I think that there are a lot of people out there who are musicians who are recording, who are not trained as engineers, who really want to be independent and create their own sound, who are going to be interested in this, who may not necessarily understand the full use of this. And I think that this program, Mixbus, is deceptively simple to look at, but extremely powerful, like one of the older boards. And, there's a lot you can do with this, but you have to understand how everything interacts and works. Right?
Yeah, that's very true.
Yeah. All right, so let's move down just to give people an overview. Here's, again, like on the individual tracks, there's the threshold that activates the compressor. Let me just take that back. Let's see, get some music going here. Let's try another track here. A little swing. And just keep dragging this down until you see the compressor start to kick in here, right? A little red area here. Explain this, Ben.
Okay, well, that red line is the gain reduction of the compressor. That's how hard the compressor is working. And we learned through many years of console development that you spend most of your time riding levels, and that occasionally means adjusting a compressor. So we put all the controls, the fader right next to the input trim, right next to the compressor threshold, right next to the compressor makeup gain, which we glossed over, but the makeup gain is the knob beneath the attack and release, beneath the speed knob.
Right here.
Yeah, and so you've got all these controls right under your fingertips, and having the level meter right next to the compressor gain reduction meter lets you see everything you need to know about level controls for that track, all in a tiny, tiny space. And it's also really cool because you can see the compressors for all your tracks. If you have a 30-track session spread out across your monitor, and you hear something it just sounds too compressed, you can quickly scan your eyes across and see, okay, who's getting slammed really hard.
Yeah, I'll just play here. You can see it. I'll drag this slider down so it really pushes it. You can see the red. That's the compressor working.
Right, and if I had noticed that happening, I would probably double think whether I really intended that to happen or not.
Yeah.
And it gives you an opportunity to go fix something like that quickly, because you can see it. You can see it happening. Unlike a plugin where you have to double-click the plugin and show the window before you know how much gain reduction you're getting. I've made a mistake several times in my life where I set up a compressor just right, and then I hid the window. And maybe an hour later, or even a day later, or even a week later, I've done some editing to that track and I've adjusted the levels on that track so that I've changed how much compression is happening. And now I'm just slamming the compressor, and I can never make it sound good. And finally, I'll think to pop open that compressor window, and I'll realize that the setting that made sense a week ago makes no sense now that I've done this editing and gain writing.
Yeah.
And so seeing those compressor gain reductions is a huge tool to help you make a better mix.
In a way, it's sort of like having a large pipe with a lot of small pipes on top of it with water flowing through it, and when you pour water in one, it affects all the other ones.
You're exactly right.
It's all interconnected, right?
That's called mixing, and that art of mixing really disappeared for the last 5 or 10 years. I mean, and I don't mean any disrespect, but it got. Let me say it a different way. It got harder for the last 5 or 10 years because the tools weren't presented to you in the way they were the decade before that.
That's right. There's a whole generation here of people that have never seen this before. They may have looked at a lot of people will never actually get into a large studio, have an opportunity to do that. I've often thought about that. Like what you're doing here is you're providing professional tools for the other. If you look at some of the big song competitions, right? And you see 70,000 people start at the head of the competition, and they've only end up with 5. Well, what happens to the other 69,952 people who want to do music, right? So, that's what this is for. It's for people who want to take the time in order to be able to really learn how to do that without the expense. I mean, small studios like mine that do a combination of music that we want high-end sound and also video production where you require high-end sounding in a different way. It's not financially viable for us to purchase a large Harrison console, even a used older one, because of the costs involved in maintaining those things.
Right.
I have a friend that's all he does is install consoles into places, and it's a vast cost for small studios like ours. And this is what you're addressing in doing this. You're making our lives a lot easier.
That's the hope and the plan, yeah.